In 1307, a Benedictine monk named Brother Anselm recorded in his monastery's ledger that a single candle lit at Vespers, around 6 in the evening, burned steadily until Lauds, the pre-dawn prayer service that began before sunrise. That's roughly 8 to 10 hours of continuous light from one candle. He wasn't describing a miracle or an exceptionally large candle. He was documenting something ordinary, something every monastery, guild hall and prosperous household in medieval Europe took for granted. Now light a candle from your local home goods store. Time it. You'll be lucky if it lasts 3 hours before the wick drowns in a pool of its own wax, sputtering out in a smoky, uneven death. The jar might still be half full of unburned wax clinging to the sides. You'll throw it away, annoyed at the waste, maybe wondering why a product you paid $15 for couldn't manage what a 13th century monk produced routinely in a cold stone scriptorium. The answer isn't just about wax quality or wick thickness. It's about a lost understanding of combustion, materials, and craft that medieval candlemakers possessed as second nature, knowledge that vanished when we traded their methods for mass production and profit margins. The tallow question medieval Europe ran on animal fat, not as a backup or a cheap substitute, but as the primary fuel for artificial light in most households. Tallow, rendered fat from cattle or sheep, was abundant, relatively inexpensive, and when properly prepared, burned with surprising efficiency. The process began in autumn during the annual slaughter when families preserved meat for winter. Nothing was wasted. Bones went to soup, hides became leather, and fat, trimmed carefully from every carcass, went into rendering pots. The rendering process itself separated medieval tallow from the greasy, foul-smelling mess most people imagine. Chandlers, professional candle makers, would heat the raw fat slowly, often for hours, skimming impurities that rose to the surface. Water was added and boiled off repeatedly, carrying away blood proteins and tissue fragments that would otherwise cause smoke and rancid odours. The best chandlers rendered tallow 3 or 4 times, producing a purified fat that was pale, relatively odourless, and had a melting point around 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. This matters more than you might think. A higher melting point means the candle remains solid longer as it burns. Modern paraffin wax, the petroleum-derived substance in most cheap candles, melts between 46 to 68 degrees Celsius, depending on grade, which sounds comparable. But paraffin lacks the complex fatty acid structure of tallow. Tallow contains a mixture of saturated and unsaturated fats, primarily stearic acid and palmitic acid, that create a stable crystalline structure as they cool. This structure doesn't just melt uniformly, it softens gradually, feeding the flame at a controlled rate. Paraffin, being a simpler hydrocarbon, melts more suddenly and pools more readily, especially in the uneven heat distribution of a poorly designed container candle. The medieval chandler understood this intuitively, even without modern chemistry. They knew that tallow from older animals burned longer than tallow from young ones. They knew that sheep fat was harder and cleaner burning than pork fat, which was too soft and smoky for quality candles. They knew that beef tallow, properly rendered, struck the best balance of hardness, burn time, and availability. This wasn't written in textbooks. It was knowledge passed master to apprentice, refined over centuries of daily practice. Beeswax superiority. If tallow was the workhorse of medieval lighting, beeswax was the thoroughbred. Churches demanded it. Nobility preferred it. Guild regulations in cities like Paris and London specified that only beeswax candles could be used in certain ceremonies and spaces. The reason was obvious to anyone who'd burned both. Beeswax candles were simply better in almost every measurable way. Beeswax melts at approximately 62 to 64 degrees Celsius, significantly higher than either tallow or modern paraffin. This meant a beeswax candle stayed rigid even in warm rooms, maintaining its shape throughout the burn. The wax didn't run down the sides in rivulets. It didn't pool excessively at the base of the wick. Instead, it liquefied in a small, controlled reservoir around the flame, wicking up into the fibre where it vaporized and combusted with remarkable completeness. But the real advantage of beeswax lay in its chemical composition. Beeswax is primarily composed of myricil palmitate and other long-chain esters, along with free fatty acids, hydrocarbons, and small amounts of propolis. This complex mixture burns cleaner than any other natural wax, producing minimal smoke and virtually no toxic residue. A well-made beeswax candle in a medieval cathedral could burn for 12 hours or more, its flame steady and bright, never needing the trimming and maintenance that tallow required. Medieval beekeepers, and there were thousands of them across Europe, harvested wax as a valuable secondary product after honey extraction. The combs were crushed and heated gently, often using solar warmth in purpose-built wax melters, then strained through cloth to remove propolis and bee parts. The resulting wax was remarkably pure, requiring none of the chemical bleaching or processing that modern manufacturers use. It was naturally golden or pale amber, with a subtle honey scent that actually improved the atmosphere rather than requiring synthetic fragrances to mask petroleum odours. The price reflected this quality. In 14th century England, a pound of beeswax cost roughly 12 times what a pound of tallow cost. For common folk, beeswax candles were a luxury reserved for special occasions, weddings, holy days, the vigil over a deceased family member. But in monasteries, which often maintained their own hives, and in the households of the wealthy, beeswax was simply the standard. Not because medieval people were wasteful or extravagant, but because a candle that burned twice as long with half the maintenance was actually economical in the long term. The wick revolution. Every medieval chandler knew that a candle was only as good as its wick. Get the wick wrong and even the finest beeswax would burn unevenly, too fast, or not at all. The wick wasn't just a piece of string jammed into wax. It was an engineered component, carefully selected and prepared to match the specific wax being used. For tallow candles, chandlers preferred cotton or flax fibres, loosely twisted, not braided, into a soft, absorbent strand. The loose twist allowed the melted fat to wick up efficiently while maintaining structural integrity as the outer fibres burned away. Too tight a twist, and the wick wouldn't absorb enough fuel, causing the flame to sputter and die. Too loose, and the wick would burn too fast, creating a large, smoky flame that wasted tallow and left carbon deposits everywhere. Beeswax required something different. The higher melting point and lower viscosity of liquefied beeswax meant wicks needed to be firmer and more tightly constructed. Chandlers often used a braided wick for beeswax, sometimes incorporating a thin thread of hemp at the core for rigidity. The braid had a specific geometry, usually a 3-strand or 6-strand pattern, that caused the wick to curl slightly as the outer layer burned. This curl brought the tip of the wick to the edge of the flame, where it would be incinerated completely, preventing the carbon buildup that creates the mushroom-shaped bloom you see on poorly wicked modern candles. This self-trimming characteristic was crucial. A modern candle often needs manual wick trimming to prevent smoking and uneven burning. Medieval beeswax candles, properly wicked, required no such intervention. The wick consumed itself at precisely the rate needed to maintain optimal flame height and fuel consumption. This wasn't accident. Chandlers tested wick thickness against candle diameter, adjusting the ratio until they achieved this self-regulating burn. Before preparing wicks, many chandlers would treat the fibre. Cotton or flax would be soaked in a mordant, often a solution of borax, saltpeter, or lime water, then dried completely. This treatment stiffened the fibres slightly and, more importantly, altered their combustion properties. A treated wick burned more slowly and completely, turning to fine ash rather than leaving charred remnants that would fall into the wax pool and create smoking. Some guild recipes called for soaking wicks in melted wax itself before use, effectively creating a primer that helped the wick ignite evenly when the candle was first lit. The diameter of the wick relative to the candle's width followed rough but reliable rules. A tallow candle an inch in diameter might use a wick 3/16 of an inch thick. Scale up the candle to 3 inches for a church altar, and the wick increased proportionally, but not linearly. The relationship was closer to the square root of the diameter, a mathematical relationship medieval craftsmen understood through experience rather than equations. Dipping and moulding. Walk into any medieval chandlery in autumn or winter, the prime candle-making seasons, and you'd witness what looked like an elaborate, repetitive dance. Apprentices stood at long tables holding sets of wicks suspended from horizontal rods. Next to them, master chandlers presided over broad, shallow vats of melted tallow or beeswax, kept at precise temperatures over carefully managed fires. The dipping process began with bare wicks. Each wick was dipped quickly into the molten wax, withdrawn, and allowed to cool in the air for 30 seconds to a minute, then dipped again and again. With each immersion, a thin layer of wax adhered to the growing candle, building up gradually, evenly, from the inside out. A standard household candle might require 15 to 20 dips. Larger candles for churches could require 50 dips or more, spread across multiple days. This slow accretion created a dense, uniform structure. The wax molecules aligned in overlapping layers, each bonding to the previous one before the next was applied. There were no air pockets, no weak points, no separation between core and surface. When such a candle burned, it consumed itself uniformly, the liquid wax pooling evenly around the wick rather than running down channels and fissures in poorly bonded wax. Temperature control was critical and required constant attention. Too hot, and the previous layer would melt before the new layer could adhere, resulting in lumpy, uneven candles. Too cool, and the wax wouldn't bond properly, creating candles that would crack or separate during use. Master chandlers learned to judge temperature by the way wax dripped from a test stick, the viscosity, the way it spread, even the sound it made falling back into the vat. Thermometers didn't exist. This knowledge lived entirely in trained senses. Molded candles, a more expensive but faster method, followed different principles but required equal skill. Chandlers used pewter or brass molds, two-piece affairs hinged on one side with a threaded wick holder at the base. The wick was pulled taut through the mold before wax was poured, ensuring perfect centering. The metal molds were often cooled in water or placed in cold cellars, causing the wax to solidify from the outside in, creating a dense outer shell. As the interior wax cooled and contracted, the chandler would top up the mold with additional melted wax, preventing the hollow core that forms in carelessly cast candles. The best molded candles had walls thick enough to prevent tunneling, that frustrating phenomenon where the center burns down faster than the edges, leaving a hollow core surrounded by wasted wax. Medieval chandlers knew the right proportion between diameter and wall thickness instinctively. A candle 2 inches wide might have walls 3/8 of an inch thick, enough to conduct heat outward and soften the outer layers gradually as the center burned. The container trap. Here's where modern candlemaking took a wrong turn. Container candles, wax poured into glass jars, tins, or ceramic vessels, are a relatively recent invention popularized in the mid-20th century. They seemed convenient. No more wax dripping on furniture, no more candle holders to clean, just light the wick and let it burn. But container candles violate nearly every principle medieval chandlers understood about controlled combustion. The container itself becomes a heat trap. As the candle burns, the glass or metal walls heat up, creating a microclimate of elevated temperature around the wax pool. This accelerates melting, causing the wax to liquefy faster than the flame can consume it. The pool grows larger, the wick drowns in liquid wax, and the flame either goes out or burns unevenly, creating that telltale tunneling effect. Medieval candles, burned as freestanding tapers, had constant air circulation around the entire circumference. Heat dissipated naturally. The wax at the edges stayed cooler and harder, forming a natural cup that contained the liquid wax pool at a manageable size. As the candle burned down, this cup descended with the flame, maintaining optimal conditions throughout the burn. The wick placement in container candles compounds the problem. Modern manufacturers typically use a single wick centered in the container. For small diameter candles, under 2 inches, this works adequately. But larger containers need multiple wicks to burn evenly, something many mass-produced candles ignore. Medieval chandlers making large ceremonial candles understood this. Candles over 3 inches in diameter sometimes incorporated 2 or 3 wicks, spaced evenly to ensure complete consumption of the wax. Then there's the wax itself. Modern container candles often use soft waxes, soy, coconut, or soft paraffin blends that melt at lower temperatures, between 40–50 degrees Celsius. These were chosen because they pour easily, adhere to glass, and can hold synthetic fragrances. But low melting points mean the entire surface of the candle liquefies quickly when burned in a container. The result? A jar half full of liquid wax with a drowning wick, rather than a controlled burn that consumes the fuel efficiently. Medieval beeswax's high melting point prevented this. Even in the warm environment of a church lit by dozens of candles, beeswax remained solid, except in the immediate vicinity of the flame. The wax fed into the fire at exactly the rate the flame could consume it, no faster, no slower. This was efficiency born of chemistry, not clever marketing. Additives and treatments. Medieval candle makers didn't have access to synthetic additives, but they weren't working with pure wax either. Various treatments and additions improved. Burn characteristics, each guarded as trade secrets within chandler guilds. One common addition was alum, potassium aluminum sulfate, which chandlers dissolved in water and used to treat wicks. Alum acted as a mordant, stiffening the fibers and, more importantly, reducing afterglow. An alum-treated wick would extinguish cleanly when the candle was snuffed, rather than smouldering and smoking. In close quarters, a bedroom, a study, this made an enormous difference in air quality. Some chandlers added small amounts of camphor to beeswax, typically 1 part camphor to 40 parts wax. Camphor raised the melting point slightly and created a brighter, whiter flame. It also imparted a clean, sharp scent that monasteries particularly favoured. Too much camphor, though, caused sputtering and produced acrid smoke, so the proportions had to be precise. For tallow candles, which were prone to rancidity and unpleasant smells, chandlers sometimes incorporated rosemary oil, lavender, or other aromatic herbs. These weren't fragrances in the modern sense, meant to make a room smell nice, but functional additives that masked the natural odour of burning fat. The amounts were minuscule, a few drops per pound of tallow, enough to be effective without creating fire hazards. A more unusual additive was saltpeter, potassium nitrate. In very small quantities, saltpeter acted as a combustion enhancer, helping the candle burn more completely and reducing smoke. This was particularly useful for tallow, which could be smoky even when well rendered. The practice was controversial, though, because too much saltpeter caused candles to burn dangerously fast and hot. Guild regulations in some cities explicitly forbade it or limited it to specific ratios. The wax itself could be blended. Chandlers making mid-grade candles might mix beeswax with tallow at ratios like 3:1 or 4:1, getting some of beeswax's superior characteristics while keeping costs manageable. These blended candles wouldn't match pure beeswax for burn time or cleanliness, but they far exceeded pure tallow. The trick was in the mixing. The two substances had to be combined at specific temperatures while both were fully melted, then stirred continuously until the mixture was homogeneous. Half-hearted blending created separated candles that burned unevenly, with layers of tallow and beeswax combusting at different rates. Seasonal craft candle making wasn't a year-round occupation for most chandlers. It followed the agricultural calendar, peaking in autumn and winter when several factors aligned favorably. First, the raw materials. Tallow came from the autumn slaughter when livestock were culled before winter. Families couldn't afford to feed full herds through the lean months, so animals were butchered in October and November, providing a sudden surplus of fat for rendering. Beeswax likewise peaked in autumn when hives were harvested for the last time before winter and honeycomb could be processed into wax. Second, the weather. Candle making required cool temperatures. In the heat of summer, even in northern Europe, wax became too soft to work effectively. Dipped candles would melt between layers. Molded candles wouldn't solidify quickly enough. But in autumn and winter, workshops stayed naturally cool, and chandlers could even use the outdoor air as a cooling medium, hanging freshly dipped candles in the breeze to set. Third, the demand. Winter was dark. Long nights meant households consumed candles at the highest rate from November through February. Chandlers produced stock in autumn to meet winter demand, timing their production so candles had a few weeks to cure, a hardening process that improved burn quality before being sold. This seasonal rhythm created quality control that modern manufacturing lacks. When you make candles only a few months per year, you pay attention. Every batch matters. There's no assembly line indifference. A chandler's reputation rested on those autumn months of production. Make poor candles and you'd hear about it all winter from customers whose light kept going out. The curing process itself mattered. Freshly made candles, whether dipped or molded, contained residual moisture and hadn't fully crystallized. Good chandlers hung finished candles in cool, dry storage for 2 to 4 weeks before sale. During this time, the wax molecules continued aligning into their most stable configuration, resulting in harder, longer-burning candles. Some chandlers aged beeswax candles even longer, 6 months or more, claiming it improved both burn time and flame quality. This wasn't superstition. Aged beeswax does crystallize more completely, creating a denser structure. The economics of light. Understanding medieval candles requires understanding their value. Artificial light was expensive, far more than modern people can easily grasp. A pound of tallow candles, enough to provide perhaps 20 hours of light, cost roughly a day's wages for a labourer in 14th century England. Beeswax was 10 times that. This wasn't like buying a pack of candles at a dollar store. This was a significant household expense. So medieval people used light carefully. Candles weren't burned casually. Families gathered around a single light source in the evening, working or socializing in that shared pool of illumination. Candles were extinguished the moment they weren't needed. Wealthy households appointed servants specifically to manage candles, lighting them at dusk, extinguishing them when rooms emptied, trimming wicks to prevent waste, collecting and remelting drippings. This economic pressure drove innovation and quality. When a product is expensive, buyers demand value. A candle that burned efficiently for 8 hours was worth more than one that burned wastefully for 3. Chandlers who consistently produced long-burning, clean candles could charge premium prices and build reputations. The market rewarded quality. Contrast this with modern candles. When a candle costs $5 and provides a few hours of atmospheric lighting, not necessary illumination, there's no economic pressure for efficiency. The candle doesn't have to burn well, it just has to smell nice and look good on a shelf. Manufacturers optimize for appearance, scent and production cost, not burn time. The result is exactly what you'd expect: pretty containers filled with mediocre wax that tunnels, drowns its wick, and leaves half its fuel unburned. The medieval economic model also supported apprenticeship and skill development. A chandler could make a living because people needed candles and would pay for quality. Apprentices spent years learning the craft because it was valuable knowledge that would support them for life. That depth of expertise, developed over decades, refined across generations, is what created candles that burned for hours. It wasn't magic. It was the accumulated knowledge of a profession that mattered. Conclusion: the difference between a medieval candle and a modern one isn't merely historical curiosity. It represents a fundamental shift in how we approach craft, quality, and the objects we use daily. Medieval chandlers worked within constraints, limited materials, no synthetic additives, no thermometers or precision instruments, but they had time, attention, and economic incentive to master their materials completely. They understood fat and wax and flame at a level modern manufacturers, focused on quarterly profits and mass production, simply don't need to achieve. When you light a candle that dies in 2 hours, leaving half its wax clinging uselessly to a jar, you're not experiencing inevitable technological limitation. You're experiencing the consequences of an economic system that prizes cheap production over functional excellence. Medieval candles burned longer because they were made by people who knew what they were doing, working with materials they understood intimately, serving customers who demanded value. The knowledge isn't lost because it was complex or difficult. It's lost because we stopped caring whether candles worked well. We wanted convenient, disposable products that looked attractive and smelled pleasant. We got exactly that, at the cost of candles that actually function as reliable light sources. The medieval chandler, if transported to a modern home goods store, would be baffled by the waste, the poor design, the casual disregard for basic principles of combustion. They'd wonder why we tolerate it. The answer, unfortunately, is that we've forgotten there's an alternative. We've forgotten that candles, made properly, can burn steadily through the night, consuming themselves completely, wasting nothing. We've forgotten what quality looks like.